In this video, I want to talk about our mixed media exploration exercise, otherwise known as the Blob Exercise. I find this is the best way to introduce some of the ideas around working with mixed media. It allows us to explore the medium without having to worry too much about the final result. In fact, the way I like to think of this exercise is almost like theater sports, where we accept whatever happens on the surface and say, yes, and we add to it. At the same time, we're going to talk a little bit about the techniques of color glazing and the wet into wet technique, and as always, the importance of the form principle. Let's jump in. So here are a few of the things that you're going to need for this exercise. Brushes, of course. Watercolor brushes are preferable if you're using watercolor, but if you're using acrylic, any old brush will do. Watercolor or acrylic, watercolor paper, pencil crayons, and/or a pen, and some water jars. I like to use two, one where I try to keep the water as clean as possible, and the other one for cleaning my brushes. I also have this oral syringe that allows me to add water quickly. Watercolors can be left in their trays. You'll just need to add some water to bring them back to life. This blob exercise is very simple, really. We're going to create some blobs with a lot of variety of color and form. And we're going to use those blobs and try to find and reveal the form within them. This is a really fun exercise, but it's also a great way of developing the skill of rendering. Now, my first blob is already a bit problematic. I didn't have enough paint on my brush, and as a result, the paint has gone down a little unevenly. But that's perfect for this exercise. This blob will end up drying in a slightly uneven way, but that's exactly what I want. As you are laying down your color, don't concern yourself too much with getting it right. Now, what I'm doing here is I'm adding some other colors into the still wet color that I've just put down. This is called the wet into wet watercolor technique. This is one of the great advantages of working with watercolor, is that the flow of the water as it dries allows the paint pigment inside that watercolor to settle and interact with itself in interesting and surprising ways. Now, once I've got these blobs put down, I'm going to use a straw and add even more variety into the shapes. I'm trying to create a variety of blobs in a variety of colors. And I now have enough, I can work on them all together here. And you can see that I'm trying to experiment with a variety of marks with my brushes. Like I say, this is a great way for us to explore the medium because there is nothing that we are trying to achieve necessarily. Now, by just flicking paint onto my surface, again, I'm adding some variety and some form that I may be able to incorporate. And here are my initial blobs. I'm going to let those dry. If you have a hair dryer, that'll speed up that process. Now in this step, glazing the shadows, I've taken a look at the forms and I've got some ideas starting to percolate as to what I want to do. I've begun mixing a color. This is a color that I tend to use quite a lot for this shadow glazing process. But essentially, I'm just trying to find the shadow groups in each of these different blobs. I'm being somewhat detailed in what I'm doing here, but I don't have to be. If, for example, you were looking at a blob and it still wasn't coming together in some specific way for you, you could, again, add your shadow shapes in a random way. Now, I'm doing something kind of particular here. I've glazed them in a particular way. You'll notice that the giraffe-looking blob on the left is a cool base color with a cool glaze, whereas the fish blob on the bottom right is a cool blob with a warm glaze. There's a subtle difference in that contrast. Having different color temperature glazes can add a lot more depth to your shadows.
So I now have my blobs, such as they are, and I've got a set of pencil crayons here. This might look like a broad spectrum, but in fact, it's just variations of 3 different colors. You may be aware of the cyan, magenta, and yellow of process color printing. Typical process color printing uses just these colors and black to create almost the entire visible spectrum. I've chosen my pencils based upon those same principles. I have some various tones and colors around the cyan. I have some various tones and values and temperatures around the magenta, and then a few around the yellow as well. I've added to that some darker tones. As well, I've also got a few of my favorite colors, such as this violet. Even if you don't have a broad set of colors like this, think about having at least a light blue, a mid-value warm reddish color, and some sort of yellow. And you'll be amazed with what you can do with just that. Now, for my blobs here, I'm going to start on this guy here, partly because I think he's very close to being done. Now, you can see here he's just basically a rather funny looking guy with something growing out of his head. I'm not really sure what it is. What I'm going to do though first is I'm going to use a cool color. Maybe this? Yeah, I think that's a little bit darker, but that's not too bad. I've already gone fairly dark here. What I'm going to do is I'm just going to start to pull out a little bit of detail in the shadow groupings, and I have a pencil sharpener that keeps my pencils very sharp. Now I'm using the value that is already down on my artboard to dictate what I do here. Yeah, this shadow is a little darker than I really intended to go right off the bat, but that's okay. I'm just going to go with it. It might turn out to be the right choice in the long run. So what I'm doing here is I'm creating what's called my first pass. And the first pass is where I generally try to define the form. And again, like I say, I'm letting the values that are there already dictate what I'm putting down here. I'm maintaining that highlight there. I can always go back though with white paint afterwards. Pull that out if I need to, but I think I've kept that pretty good. And I'm going to do the same thing on the other side. Again, I'm just using the values that are currently there. Again, this first pass here, I'm not going too dark. You can see here in the light side of the face, I'm actually being fairly light-handed, I would say. I'm not going too dark. I'm still using the same color, however. I'm committed now, aren't I? Keep your pencils sharp. Sage advice to you, keep your pencils sharp if you're working this way. Okay, now I've been working with these cool shadow color, but this would be a good time to start going and finding those warm tones that really make an illustration come to life. But I'm going to come along here with my light magenta. I'm going to start working the transition area of the shadows. And pull out a fair bit of warm tones through the nose here. But you can see I'm focusing mostly on this transition point between the light grouping and the shadow grouping. We talked about that in my form principle video about how color shifts through the spectrum as it rounds, or the light rounds a form. We see that color shift. And that's why I'm spending so much time right at that transition point between the light grouping and the shadow grouping, because that is where we're most likely to see these lovely, surprising colors. I'm not covering the entire nose, as you can see here, leaving a little bit of that so that I can come back with some even lighter color and I won't have to have anything too heavy already applied. See, I'm just glazing here. I'm going to pull out a fair bit of warm tones around the eyes and the eyelids. These are usually the thinnest parts of skin on our face, and as a result they do tend to show a lot of the color of the blood vessels underneath.
Now, as I'm working here, I'm starting to layer my colors. And as I layer my colors, they begin to blend on the surface a little bit more. And here, I'm beginning to go over top of those initial darker colors with a lighter color. That light blue works to work as a blender to blend the colors underneath. The same is happening here with this yellow. It's blending. And finally, I'll go in with the lightest color, white, to blend again further these pencil crayons. And so at this point, I'd like to put in a couple of highlights. I'm using my acrylic gouache, a water-soluble paint, and with a very small brush, I'm just going to pull out a few highlights here. I've mentioned before in my Principles of Form video that texture is often seen in the highlights. And there is our blob exercise. I hope you had fun. Take a photo of your blobs and send them to me.